Welcome to the Evolved Caveman, where men learn to be successful and happy with your host, Dr. John Schinnerer, as he shares the most impactful ideas and practices for you to get the most from your relationships, your work, and from your life. Now here's Dr. John.
Hey everybody, this is Dr. John back with the latest episode of the Evolved Caveman podcast, and I am thrilled to have with me here today Joshua Coleman, PhD, Dr. Coleman, who is a psychologist in private practice and senior fellow with the Council on Contemporary Families. He is a frequent guest on NPR and Today. His advice has also appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, CNN, and other publications. And the reason he's here today is his latest book entitled Rules of Estrangement: Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict. It is a guide for parents whose adult children have cut off contact that reveals the hidden logic of estrangement, explores its cultural causes, and offers practical advice for parents trying to reestablish contact with their adult children. As a trusted psychologist whose own daughter cut off contact for several years and eventually reconciled, Dr. Joshua Coleman is uniquely qualified to guide parents in navigating these fraught interactions. Joshua, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, John. Looking forward to it.
So to kick things off, tell me a little bit about you at your very best, that story of sort of hassle to happiness.
Hassle to happiness. Oh, that's a good way to phrase it. Well, I mean, I assume you mean how kind of I came to specialize in this field of estrangement. Sure, I was married in my 20s and have a daughter who's in her late 30s from that first marriage. And like many people, the estrangement resulted from the divorce. Not so much the divorce, but kind of my remarriage and having children from my current marriage of some 30 years. There are many ways I think my daughter felt displaced by that marriage, in addition to the kind of ongoing tension with her mother and I, who are, kind of on speaking terms again, but weren't in many ways for many years. And so there was a period of time in my daughter's early 20s where she cut off contact for several years, in part in response to some of those tensions. And it was easily the most heartbreaking, painful, upsetting thing that I've ever been through or would hope to go through again. And at the time, there was really nothing written on it. The advice that I got from therapists was really counterproductive. And so I, kind of worked my way back to her basically through empathy and taking responsibility and not defending myself. And over time, we were able to reconcile. And, today we're very close. But that period of time gave me made it a mission of mine to help, other parents who are going through it, since there just still isn't really enough information out there.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to the pain that is caused by parental alienation. My daughter has been estranged from me for 8 years as a result of my divorce.
So sorry.
And it's definitely the most painful part of divorce. It's just brutal, and that's one of the things you don't really see coming.
Yep.
And I think for many it's hurtful because you just feel it's not deserved.
No, exactly. And so many of the parents that I work with were like, I could never have imagined this happening to me. I was so close to my kid before divorce. I figured, well, we'll divorce and it'll be hard, but, we're so close to such a good foundation. There's no way we won't be. And so many parents, dads in particular, dads have a much higher chance of being estranged after a divorce for a bunch of different reasons. One is that the courts are still basically antiquated in terms of prioritizing contact with the dad. They often don't prioritize it or don't protect father-child relationships, so they don't give enough custody, and then that weakens the attachment to the child. And if the mother's at all motivated, if the mother is at all motivated to hurt the relationship with the child, it's not very hard to do particularly if the child is young. But even if it's a gray divorce, even if the divorce occurs in adulthood. So I think it is a shock to most parents.
So let's back up a little bit and just define our terms, which is always a favorite of mine, because I didn't realize this when we first talked, the difference between the terms estrangement and parental alienation. So can you define those briefly for me?
Yeah, there are some of the people who write about parental alienation use parental alienation to only mean those cases where the child has been poisoned against the other parent, and they use estrangement for those cases where the child is rejecting the parent for legitimate reasons. I actually think that that's not a useful difference, because most people think about estrangement in the more general sense. So from my perspective, alienation is just one of the many ways that a parent can become estranged from a child. Certainly, some estrangements can occur because the parent was abusive or neglectful or uncritical in an ongoing way. So that's typically what they mean when they make that distinction. But
is there a different term? Pardon me for interrupting. Is there a different term for that sort of justified parental alienation?
No, there's not.
It seems like that would be really useful too, to say, okay, yeah, the parent actually did something that is deserving of this, like abuse.
Exactly. Yeah, I was at a conference where speaking at a conference of where they were talking about alienation, and that was my point exactly. If we're going to make that distinction, let's call it justified estrangement or justifiable estrangement. But to call it estrangement, it's part of the popular lexicon. So people, it has all kinds of meanings that don't mean justified estrangement. So anyway, period.
And the reason I think this is important is that I think we humans tend to, the brain's a cognitive miser, so it likes shortcuts. So we like to look at these things as, bad parent, or that child was entitled and spoiled and they deserved that. I think we go to one side or the other. We pick a side, and it's far too complex of an issue for that.
It's way too complex of an issue. So there's some things where, the child or the other parent might say, well, it was justified. And the parent who's being rejected might say, well, actually, it's not justified. Mm-hmm. So who's to say, right? That's part of the problem. So unless this is being litigated in a court of law where you can have expert witnesses and child psych evaluations and the like, it's very difficult to make these kind of determinations. So that's why I think it's problematic. So the way I think of it is estrangement is kind of the overall concept, and alienation should be considered as an aspect of estrangement, one of the many ways that estrangement can occur.
Okay, so sort of to your point that you just mentioned, so to me, it's easy for those waters to get muddied during divorce, and anger arises, and both parents might badmouth each other to the children. It's not ideal, but it does happen.
Right.
And so, how do you identify the existence of parental alienation?
Well, I think that the research by Amy Baker has been really useful. She has 12 different signs of alienation. So interviews with the child. So some of the common features of alienation are black and white. Thinking that the child's mistrust of the parent seems coached, that there's a history of obstructed visitation or reconciliation therapy, that there's a history of the other parent kind of attempting to influence the mind of the child, that the beliefs of the child seem very coached, and if they're sort of explored, don't really hold up to examination. I mean, those are just some of the things, but Baker has done some good research in that area.
And is there any research that indicates sort of the comparative percentages of fathers versus mothers that experience alienation?
Yeah, the closest I've been able to see is that something like 10 to 11% of mothers experience. Oh, did you say estrangement versus alienation?
Well, either. I mean.
Oh, yeah.
I said alienation, but I'm flexible.
Okay, that's good. In terms of just there being lack of contact between the parent, whether it's for divorce or other reasons, around 10 to 11% of mothers report being estranged from an adult child, whereas a much higher, I think it's closer to 20% of fathers are estranged. And that could also includes non-marital relationships, and those are much more vulnerable to later estrangement, where the parents never married.
Okay. And, the other thing I wanted to mention, I just remembered. So the book comes out March 2nd, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So if you're looking for the book, if you're listening to this, check out any of the major book distributors, Amazon or others, and you can get the book on March 2nd. I'm not sure when this is going to come out, but it's going to come out right around there. So the timing will be good.
And also I have there's sort of a bonus on my website. If you order it at my website, you can get a free video of a webinar that I did on making amends to your adult child, which is a very important part of my method, as well as a sample chapter. So that's if you pre-order. So,
and that's, you go to drjoshuacoleman.com.
Right. Yeah. Dr. Joshua Coleman. Yeah.
Great. Oh, yeah. Thank you. So one of the things I thought was interesting, though, is your emphasis on sort of the cultural influences on estrangement and alienation. I guess it's more specific to parental alienation. Can you go through some of those? I found those interesting.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's true of both alienation and estrangement. So let's just speak broadly about the decision of an adult child. My work is more around adults. That's probably a better area for me to comment in terms of my expertise. So certainly divorce. If we think of what's happened in the past half century, the past 50 years or so. So we see high rates of divorce, particularly for boomer parents. So something like 50% of boomer parents are divorced. In my own research, I did a survey of 1,600 estranged parents at the University of Wisconsin and found that something like 70% of those parents had been divorced. So divorce can increase the likelihood of estrangement, not only because of alienation of one parent poisoning the child against the other parent, but also it can cause the child, independently of the parent's influence, to see one parent as the bad guy, another as the good guy. It can bring in new people to the child's life that they have to compete with for emotional or physical material resources, step siblings, half siblings, other step parents. It can cause the child in a highly individualistic culture like ours to view the parent more as an individual, less as a family unit that they're a part of. So divorce alone is a huge predictor of a later estrangement. But as important to that is rising rates of individualism. So rising desire to sort of see oneself as an individual with one's own identity. And so relationships to other people, including family, are much more predicated on the principle of, does this relationship feel good? Is it in line with my ideals and my values, including my political beliefs? If it's not, then I'm going to reject that person. Rejecting a parent, estranging a parent, is now considered an act of existential courage rather than, really betraying that parent. Even though that still exists, our culture is much more around kind of what's going to improve my feelings of self-esteem and identity and the like. And so cutting off parent is now considered kind of an act of strength. The increasing role of therapy, of therapeutic narratives, where people have a lot of support for cutting off parents that might not have existed. If you look at therapy in the 1960s, there was much more of an emphasis on conformity, fitting in, and the like. Now therapy is much more oriented towards reducing guilt, reducing feelings of obligation, not being codependent, and all that kind of a thing is also an influence here. So those are just some of the influences, yeah.
One of the other ones that comes up is the desire for happiness, or in fact, people's feeling of entitlement to being happy, which I get at one level. However, I've done some research into divorce, and the biggest complaint that I hear from the wives is, I can't connect with my husband, i.e., I'm not happy in this relationship, which now seems to be, for many people, a satisfactory reason for getting divorced, which is interesting.
Well, I think you're raising a good point, because that's the same reason that somebody might become estranged. The relationship with the parent doesn't make me happy. So the pursuit of happiness has really become kind of the central determinant of who we stay in touch with. So you're right. It's very parallel to what will keep a couple together. It's the same thing that is what will keep a parent and an adult child together.
And it's fascinating to me, because just to give listeners a bit of contrast, you talk about individualism and the individualistic culture, and it's kind of about me and how I feel. And yet if you go to China, Japan, in the East, you don't see this sort of thinking, because it's a collectivist culture. The family unit is primary, not the individual.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
And so that just kind of fascinates me. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some tools to prevent alienation. So let's say I'm a father going through a divorce right now. How do I make sure that I maintain a relationship with my children? What can I do?
Well, if your children are minors, you want to make sure you have an attorney. Even if you don't think there's a big chance of becoming alienated, you still want to have an attorney who is sophisticated about that, because there's a lot of things that can start out looking more innocuous that can later develop into the cancer of alienation. So you want to have the legal, as I've said, the courts are not, it's a pretty crude instrument, but you want to use it for all that it's worth. And so you want to make sure that there are safeguards for visitation, particularly if you're a father, to make sure that you're going to have visitation. If it's reconciliation therapy, if the alienation, case of alienation has been determined, then you have to make sure that there's safeguards in place to ensure that the kids attend the reconciliation therapy, because some parents won't do that unless there's some kind of a censure from the court. Then the other parent will bow out of it. One of the mistakes that's easy for any of us parents to make is when our kids have complaints, if we know that it's been sort of caused by the other parent, it's hard for us to not, either blame the other parent when our children say it, or to defend ourselves aggressively. And by the time a kid has a memory or a belief about you, strong enough to report it to you, it's kind of what they believe and what they think. And your authority to say, no, you're wrong, once there's a divorce, you've kind of lost that authority and that ability. As much as you still deserve it, you no longer have that. So you have to be able to empathize with whatever kernel of truth your child's complaint is, to just feel like you're a loving, empathic, resilient, dedicated parent. You basically have to position yourself as being in alliance with your child rather than in opposition to them in any way.
So could you give us a simple example of empathizing and validating with a child? Because I don't think that ability, that skill comes naturally to most men.
No, I totally agree with you. It's something that I see and have struggled with myself. So it's something that I've certainly taken quite a few years.
I'm still working on it.
Two marriages evolved. Speaking of the evolved caveman, right? It's really putting yourself in your child's shoes. So for an example, it might be, let's say one of your ex's criticism of you is that you were, or complaints about you was that you were too critical of her. And maybe you were, maybe you weren't, but you know that you were never too critical as a father. You know that as a dad, you were pretty reasonable, dedicated, loving father. But now your child is saying, well, Dad, you were always so critical of us, or so critical of me. Your temptation is going to be to say, either no, I wasn't, or you're misremembering, or your mom has told you that, or you're mixing up your mom's complaints, versus your own complaints. You're far better off just saying, oh, I'm really sorry. I didn't realize that I came across that way to you. That makes me sad to hear it. That's something I'm happy to work on. Will you let me know the next time you feel that way? So again, you're positioning yourself. It sort of goes back to what we were talking earlier about relationships needing to be based on happiness. You have to sort of be thinking about, well, what's going to make this kid feel happy, even if what they're reporting we know has been, curated by the other parent.
Yeah, and one of the things in addition to that, which I think is an excellent answer, is to validate what they're feeling, which basically means, you know this, but for the listeners,
yeah, of course,
it basically means taking your best guess at what you think they're feeling. So, right. Gee, honey, it sounds like you're really frustrated about that.
Yeah.
And I understand that. I get that. And, sometimes you might get something back like, well, I'm not frustrated, I'm resentful, or, right. You might be a little bit off, but that's okay. There was a study that came out recently that showed that one of the best defenses that you have against someone else's anger and hurt is to simply validate what they're feeling, that it reduces the intensity of it. And so I think in these situations, it's a really good way to go. And I really, one of the things that I deal with a lot is men, it's beyond anger, it's rage, fury, indignance that they get in these breakups. And when we get angry, I think we tend to externalize all blame onto others. And in this case, it could be our wives/ex-wives. And then when we get some of that criticism from the other party, the other camp, we get really defensive. In fact, I mean, we get defensive anyway. What are some ideas that you have to reduce our defensiveness in these sorts of situations so that ideally we can learn better about what we did or what we might do differently?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think part of it is to learn to not respond when you're feeling upset, because that's when you're probably going to respond in the worst way. So if you have something that you want to say to your child, to wait till you feel really calm and centered, and then say it. But if you know that you blew it, and if you know that you said something that was really hurtful or much angrier than you either felt or was productive, then it's always useful to go back and repair it, and to say, I'm really sorry about that. I really lost my temper. That was inappropriate. You didn't deserve that. What was that like for you? Maybe you say that. But to take responsibility, I think, is really the chief thing. But to also just let yourself kind of coach yourself that, anger is not your friend in these situations. Yeah. So, to kind of remind yourself that.
And I like the idea also of some of these disagreements, let's say, might take multiple conversations to disentangle.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I also, and this is personally for me, I like the idea of keeping the conversations relatively limited in length of time. Because I think so many people get flooded emotionally in these highly charged conversations. Right. That if you think, kind of keeping it sweet and short and sweet, like 15 minutes, maybe 10 minutes is probably a good way to go. I just want to go back and make sure we didn't miss anything, because I think this is a really important question. So are there any other tips or tools to engage in meaningful conversations with children who have been cut off from us?
Yeah, I mean, again, depending on the age of the intellectual development, for adult children or teenagers even.
Yeah, let's talk teens and adults.
Okay, yeah. I always recommend that parents write some kind of a letter of amends. And the letter of amends should have, your goal is just to really see it from your child's perspective, to take responsibility, not blame the other parent, not blame anybody else, not blame the child. It might be tempting to say, well, you had problems with addiction, or you were acting out, or you were difficult, or you had learning disabilities or ADD. You don't want to say anything that's going to make the child feel defensive. It's all about your ability to empathize with them. So again, you try to find the kernel of truth. So again, like with the criticism thing, it's clear that I was much more critical than I was aware of, and I'm really sorry, or I could see how you would have felt let down by that, or hurt by that, or the like. You just mostly, it's a letter of amends because you're trying to get them to see that you care and that you want to repair, and that or you're positioning yourself as an open, safe person for them to talk to and confide in. So that's one of the chief things. But sometimes it's useful, kind of to your earlier point, to just reach out with kind of innocuous text, just like, hey, did you see let's say you have a shared interest in an actor or something. Did you see the new Matt Damon movie or whatever? It's really good, or if some other kind of thing, that some sort of area of shared interest. So it's just kind of a way to connect in a non-emotional way. And maybe you do that once a month, depending on the age of the child. Now, you should stop reaching out, from my perspective, if you're getting restraining orders sent, threats of the police being called, your child, particularly your adult child, saying, you can only talk to me through my attorney, or you're getting letters sent back unopened. Typically, that means things are way too inflamed for right now for there to be anything productive. So I usually counsel parents to wait a year, at least if the kid's an adult, before trying again, because it just means things are just way too hot.
Okay, yeah, and thank you for that. Excellent answer. One of the things that also comes up when I'm working with divorced families or divorcing families is, I'll have a client come in and be really upset that the other parent is quote unquote lying about them. And I say quote unquote because it's really hard to tell what the truth is a lot of times. Yeah. But, someone comes in and they're upset because the other parent is lying about them to the children. Do you have any thoughts on how we can how do we best deal with those lies, quote unquote, coming from the other parent?
Well, there's sort of a difference between what we tell ourselves and what we tell our children. The main thing is not to, if the other parent is basically engaging in a form of child abuse, which is lying about you, your child is going to feel very underwater psychologically. They're probably going to feel depressed about it. The research on parental alienation shows it's not only damaging to the parent who's being alienated, it's also damaging to the child. To have these lies told about the parent being poisoned, have their love for that parent poisoned against them. So the main task of the parent is you're kind of the one adult in the room. So in your self-dialogue, what you tell yourself is, oh, that's a bunch of bullshit. I can't believe this. And, you talk to your closest friends about it and, how furious you feel and how unjust it is and all the things that you want to do. But to your child, you have to just be the adult in the room. And, if the child says something like, well, mom says you never paid her child support. Instead of saying what you want to say is like, oh my God, what a bunch of crap that is. She's just trying to poison you against me. You just say, I'm not sure why mom would say that. I have the canceled. Would you like to see the canceled checks? I have them. But then you quickly want to pivot back to the child's experience and say, wow, that must have been really upsetting for you when mom said that. And, so again, you want to make it about them, not about you. The more you can show that you can make it about them and you're concerned for them, the more trustworthy you're going to seem. And the more you make it about you, the more confused they'll be, even though you deserve for that to be made about you. It's just not by them, basically.
Yeah, it makes sense because then they get put in the middle of a he said, she said sort of conversation. And it does become crazy making for the kids, or it can.
Yeah.
So just in general, if we have listeners that are going through divorce, what sort of common mistakes do you see that happen while divorcing, and how can we not participate in them? How can we avoid them?
Sure. Well, while you're divorcing, the strongest temptation is to get the kids to ally with you. I think it's sort of a human instinct particularly if you feel that the other parent is poisoning the children against you. It's human nature to want to do that, or just to confide in them about the other parent's problematic behavior, whether the other parent had an affair or blew through all the money, or to explain the reasons for the divorce to the child. All of that's burdensome to children, and and children will often want to know, and I still think that they should be largely protected from that, because children are going to be very tempted to side against one parent with the other parent. So you want to make sure you have enough support so that you can be that sort of safe place for your kid, because the other parent, may not be being that. So it's mostly about making sure you have enough support so that you can do that really, really hard work of not reacting in the way that it's just human nature to react. So I think that's sort of the main mistake, is kind of not being protective enough of your child from all the feelings that get stirred up with a divorce, of betrayal, rage, anger, hurt, rejection, etc.
Yeah, I think it's a really good answer. I think most of us parents have little idea of how our kids are feeling in the midst of a divorce.
Right.
I think that's true. Well, I won't go into that. But so one of the big questions that I have is, because I've dealt with clients in this situation, like, for instance, a grandmother that's been estranged from her grandchildren, or, a father that's been alienated from his daughter. And it's at the point where it's sort of out of their hands. There's not really anything they can work on or do to create a situation to make amends or even have a conversation, because things are just so bad that the other party has just decided, I don't want any part of you. So how do we move on if the relationship with our child or adult child is severed and it's out of our hands?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I think it's a very tragically common question that I see in my practice. My kid won't talk to me, hasn't talked to me for, 4, 8, 10, 20 years in some cases. And I think, as parents, we're pulled to feel like we should always be thinking about our children. I think it's just in some ways part of our wiring to be wondering how they're doing and thinking, should we do something different? But at some point, it stops being adaptive. If your child isn't talking to you and is basically treating you either like the enemy or like somebody that they don't love or care about, even though I think that children do, they aren't behaving in that way, it isn't really self-interested to keep trying. And so what I tell parents is to, I think the concept of radical acceptance is really useful. The idea that you just kind of say, it is what it is. I mean, for me, I learned about radical acceptance well before I knew that it had a name. I was kind of in the midst of my estrangement with my daughter and kind of pining for her and feeling guilty and mad and sad and, hopeless. And at some point I found myself thinking, you know what? She may never talk to you again. Last time you saw her, that may be it. So you better just accept it and move on. And not in kind of a harsh, critical voice. It's just kind of like, dude, this may be it. So, you can't let it poison and ruin your life. And so that's what I always tell parents. Your children actually don't deserve that. They don't deserve to ruin your life. You're having a good, happy life is part of your birthright. And even if you have criticisms, I mean, part of the reason I want parents to write a men's letter is sort of so you can say you've done everything that you can do as a parent. So you can say to them and yourself, okay, I've taken responsibility for the mistakes that I made or the ways that I let you down. But now, sweetheart, it's kind of in your camp. You can either take the olive branch or not, but I'm not going to continue to make myself miserable about that. So, it may mean kind of shutting down that chamber of your heart with your kid's name on it so that you can not have to have them so constantly in your mind. But it's a really important thing to do, to not let it ruin your life, because it can.
Yeah.
It can completely ruin
and I love that you brought up radical acceptance, because that's one of the tools that really got me through my divorce. One of the tools I share with clients. And it's as simple as having 3 or 4 statements on a 3x5 card in your wallet. Things like, if I may, one of the ones on my, I'll share this with you, although it's a little embarrassing. One of the statements on mine was, the present moment is fine just as it is, even if it sucks ass. So that's a clinical phrase, sucks ass.
Oh yeah, we learned that. But we learned that in grad school for sure.
But the implication is, even if it's painful, even if it's difficult, like, it's okay.
Right.
And the other one is something like, I can handle this and breathe. And, this moment was made up as the result of thousands of other decisions that came before it. And I think the other thing that helped me was just reminding myself that it's out of my control, that I have done everything possible to repair that bridge, and it's been rebuffed. And okay, that's not my decision. So I could, if I look ahead to my deathbed, I can look at it without regret, as having lived without regret, because I've done everything that I could do to repair that relationship.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's why you should do everything that you can do for a period of time, and then maybe you stop. And what I tell parents is, you write one really good amends letter, that has the features that I talked about, and then maybe a follow-up 6 to 8 weeks later, where you say, just checking in with you to see if you got the letter, see if you had any reactions to it, positive or negative. I'm sure that there were things I left out that would have been useful to have included, but I just wanted to get the conversation started. Hope you'll let me know. If you want to respond, I promise to read it from the perspective only of learning and not in any way to defend myself. If you want to do family therapy, work with a mediator, I'm happy to do that as well. Then you're kind of done, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you may decide to continue to send out occasional texts, but in terms of what you can actually do, you've sort of done what you can do. And so you do have to, at that point, start letting yourself off the hook and not keep turning yourself over and over, some painful stone where you just feel like you're just supposed to suffer for the rest of your life. No, you shouldn't.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's one of the ultimate emotional management tasks.
I agree.
Out there, because it really, it's a new level of pain.
It is.
And I think you're absolutely right. You can't carry that around forever. It's just too painful.
It is, and there's not a lot of social support for it. I mean, as a psychologist as well, it's kind of like, it's where psychologists were sort of supposed to kind of know better. So when I was going through mine, it's hard to talk about to people, because the assumption is, well, you must have done something pretty screwed up, for your kid to have turned against you. I mean, how innocent can you be? And the reality is that, I definitely made mistakes. Do I feel like I deserve to be estranged? No, but my daughter did. So that's where it landed. But there's there's not enough support out there, because people don't really understand it. And then that means that people don't talk about it. That means they feel much more isolated and alone. And so, that's why it's good that you're doing this kind of a podcast, because I think it helps people to not feel like they're the only ones, because I think everybody feels like they are. Yeah.
And I think there's a huge number of fathers out there that have dealt with this or are dealing with this. So Absolutely. I appreciate you coming on board. Let's take a brief foray into traditional masculine ideology, kind of, that traditional men are tough, not like women. We're successful, we compete, we're aggressive, we're homophobic, we're self-reliant, we're always ready for sex, and that literally is traditional masculine ideology. And, there's a percentage, maybe 45% or so of men in this country that subscribe to that pretty forcefully. Yeah. How does that sort of thinking enter into all of this?
No, I think it's a really good question, because I think that, in some ways, some of those ideals, certainly not the homophobia or always being ready for sex, make men better dads, but there's a lot about what works while a couple is married in let's just call it fatherhood, not even necessarily traditional masculinity. Men as dads tend to be more direct, less guilt-ridden, more sort of results-oriented. They sometimes have more of a coaching mentality, kind of like, well, you're not going to get, a gold star from me unless you actually do a good job.
No participation ribbons.
Right, exactly. And I think there's aspects of that which is really useful for kids' development, and the research actually bears that out. The kids who, that a good involved dad is in many ways different than a good sort of whatever we want to call traditional. The term is, gets looser and looser with time. But a lot of those really good things that make a good dad while they're married may not work as well after a divorce, because after a divorce, you sort of have to shift into a perspective that's much more sensitive, much more collaborative, empathic, where that kind of, much less oriented around respect. I think dads in general do a better job than moms do about demanding and expecting a certain amount of respect. I think mothers are often more confused about that, kind of what's coercive authority versus reasonable authority, whereas I think dads don't have that kind of conflict. But I think post-divorce, that's more problematic, that demand for respect, because then the terms have changed, kind of what we've been talking about, your point earlier, that it's much more based on happiness. So you can't really demand the kind of respect that you could pre-divorce. So a lot of these things that might make a dad stronger in marriage actually makes the relationship potentially weaker post-divorce when you don't have the same kind of authority.
Yeah, it makes me think that maybe that's one of the silver linings in divorce, one of the reasons for it, that it's the wake-up call for men to evolve. Because all the directions you're talking about, being more empathetic, being more communicative, those are not things that come naturally to us, and it generally takes a radical shattering of one's framework, the lenses through which we see the world, in order to motivate that sort of change. And maybe divorce is it.
Yeah, I think that might be that's a really good point. Although sometimes just estrangement is it as well. I sometimes work with dads, more often than not they've been divorced, but sometimes they haven't, but their child has estranged themselves because they felt like, they just had some complaint about the parent not being as sensitive or tuned in or affectionate or whatever it is. And the dad in particular may have just defended, but then they finally realize, oh, crap, I better do something really different here if I want to keep this kid in my life. And so I see in family therapy, dads often need help getting into it, but they can get there. And when they can get there, to me, there's nothing more touching than seeing a father cry to his daughter or his son on occasion. They're more likely to cry to their daughters than their sons. But either way, to me, there's nothing more touching that a guy is willing to do that. And there's nothing more compelling to the adult child is on the other end of it, about the father's love and depth of commitment. Because I think one of the problems with masculinity is that it makes dads look a lot more like we don't care when we actually do. We can look a lot less devastated than we really are. So it can be confusing terrain to navigate.
Yeah, the mask of stoicism.
Right, exactly.
The other thing that was funny, you were mentioning earlier, kind of talking about fatherhood and the need for fathers. And I do believe strongly that fathers have a huge place in raising healthy children, and the research bears that out. And one of the things that I think we're useful for is activating the nervous system of the child, kind of exciting them, roughhousing, then we calm. The mothers generally are teaching more emotional regulation, like keeping things calm. Yeah. And the fathers are usually riling them up. And then, I love the meme of, the dad throwing the baby up into the air and what the dad sees and the baby's like a foot above his hands, and what the baby sees and the baby's like 6 feet in the air, and what the mom sees and the baby's 40 feet up in the air. and I think there's truth to that, right? That it's all perception. And, what are you doing? You're throwing the baby in the air,
Right.
But there's a purpose for that. There's a reason.
No, I love that research as well. The study that comes to mind about that, it was this group of researchers had a man and woman have their toddler stack of blocks, behind a two-way mirror. So the researchers were on one side and the couple was on the other side. And moms were like, okay, come on, sweetheart, you can do it. They're like, and they're coaching, they're empathizing with the frustration when the kid, gets frustrated. And the dads mostly were just kind of sitting back, kind of going, all right, you'll figure it out. Come on. And there's a real value in that, and I think that in the same way that, we shouldn't really idealize the female model of intimacy, which is much more, I think there's a lot of value to it, but I think there's a way that women have co-opted that ideal in ways that I don't think is fair. I think that the more common male model of intimacy, which is much more action-based, kind of participation sort of based, has in some ways been co-opted by the more female model of communication, self-disclosure, that sort of thing. Both have their value, but I think the same is true of parenting, that the more affectionate, intensive, emotionally based form of parenting is just a different form than the more kind of dad orientation, which, to your point, is more activation oriented, more adventure oriented, more risk oriented. Like, for example, when I was a teenager, I used to have a fear of when I was a young child, I used to have a fear of getting lost. And my father used to take me to local hockey games in Dayton. And he would say, and I was like 6 or something. He'd say, okay, so we're going to find our seats, and then I'm going to have you go back, down to the concession stand, which is all the way on the other side of the stadium, get the popcorn and come back. At the time I was terrified. He said, no, here's how you do it. And, that was like an incredible act of parenting. So my mom, I'm sure if she were there, would be like, don't do that. That's so mean, But he was like, no, he'll figure it out. And similarly, when I was a teenager, he supported my hitchhiking across the country, which my mother was very much against. Wow. And that, and that was also really useful for me psychologically. So I think it's often is the more kind of male paternal perspective, which is super useful for kids.
Yeah, I love that example because I think it's, kind of encouraging, if not forcing your child to step into their fear in order to conquer it.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And I think it's one of the ways that you do it, right? It's one of the ways you deal with anxieties and fears is you go right after them.
Absolutely. It's like the only way to really deal with it is to
under somewhat controlled circumstances.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's better than letting your 6-year-old take a bus across New York City to get home from school. But I think there's limits.
I actually kind of admired that parent who did that.
You remember that?
Yeah, I do. No, I thought that was kind of a ballsy thing to do. I think a kid might have been a little.
I think it's very brave of the parent. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I couldn't have done it, but she has mad respect for me for doing that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so the book comes out March 2nd, and one of the things I wanted to remind the listeners of, because I think this is a huge service that you offer.
Thanks.
So Dr. Coleman, Joshua, does a free question and answer session online every Monday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. And if you're interested in this, if you're suffering from alienation or estrangement, this would be a great resource. And you can find out more at his site, drjoshuacoleman.com. And that's doctor with D, that's DR, Joshua Coleman. And then you can also pre-order the book at his website or any major bookseller. Again, free gift if you go to his site and order it. And Joshua, just in wrapping up, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you would like to add or answer?
No, but just by way of information, I also do webinars every Tuesday for estranged parents. So about how to deal with your kid's mental illness or their therapist or divorce or difficult son-in-law, daughter-in-law. There's like 15 different topics and Thursday, my colleague Barbara Dreisen does one on strategies to deal with the pain of estrangement and alienation. So we have one on radical acceptance, self-compassion, CBT, DBT. So those are useful as well. But in terms of this topic, no, I think you've covered really the major issues. I mean, my biggest, I just think this is such an area where people really need support. So if it's not at my website, then find other Facebook sites. There's a lot of them out there, because I think the feeling of social isolation is really the most painful part of this, feeling alone with it. And so I guess that would be the other thing that I would just emphasize.
Well, which I think is also what we men do after something like a divorce. We kind of
exactly.
isolate in the man cave,
right,
which is probably the worst thing to do. But with COVID, who the hell knows?
I know, it's even harder.
Opens up a whole new can of worms. But I just want to say that I really appreciate your work in this area, and you have my heartfelt gratitude for coming alongside and just sharing your wisdom with us, because I think it's a really important topic for men, but also women, parents, family members, of which we all are. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thank you for your good work in your area of specialization. It's much needed. So we'll look forward to being in touch.
Sounds good. And that is it for this episode of The Evolved Caveman. Remember, please like, review, and share to get the word out to others. Thanks so much. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Evolved Caveman podcast. If you like what you've heard, support us by subscribing, leaving reviews, and sharing the podcast with friends and colleagues. For the latest, most powerful tools to connect with like-minded men, join the Facebook group at The Evolved Caveman. Follow Dr. John on Instagram at The Evolved Caveman, all one word, or join the email list by visiting guidetoself.com.